Morning, boys and girls. Welcome to our literacy lesson today. You are going to make sure that you have your listening ears ready, your exercise book and your pencil. Okay, let's do our action word first today. Our action word today is pretending to hide something. So you're going to grab something and pretend to hide it. Pretend to hide it. The word is tuck. 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 I took it. I took it. I took it. Amazing. I took it. Took. 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 T-O-O-K. 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 Took. T-O-O-K. I'd like you to practice our action word. T-O-O-K. Okay, let's practice writing it. Once you've practiced doing your action word, you can pause and practice it a bit more if you like. T-O-O-K. Took. Took. I took it. I'd like you to pause and practice that. So boys and girls, here is Paddington, and as you saw yesterday at the end of our story time, Paddington was delivered to our class for us to look after him. His suitcase is on the screen. That's the suitcase he came in yesterday, isn't it? And he came with a special letter from Aunt Lucy asking us to look after him and keep him safe, alongside a lovely jar of his favourite marmalade. Today we are going to be reading our next story, which is Paddington. After we've read it, we're going to be doing a story map. So you need to make sure you've got your listening ears ready to write down what happened at the end. Are you ready to listen to the story of Paddington, the original Paddington adventure? The author of Paddington is Michael Bond. The illustrations are by R.W. Alley. Let's get started. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting to meet their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry near the left luggage office. "It looks like a bear," he said. "A bear?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "On Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." But Mr. Brown was right. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked "Wanted on Voyage." And as they drew near, it stood up and politely raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said. "May I help you?" "It's very kind of you," said Mr. Brown, "but as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" The bear looked around carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America on your own?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Whatever did you do for food?" Unlocking the suitcase, the bear took out an almost empty glass jar. "I ate marmalade," it said. "Bears like marmalade." Mrs. Brown looked at the label around the bear's neck. It said, quite simply, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." "Oh, Henry, she cried. "We can't leave him here all by himself. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come home and stay with us?" "Stay with us?" repeated Mr. Brown nervously. He looked down at the bear. Would you like that?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, "if you have nothing else planned." "Oh, yes," replied the bear. "I would like that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry." "That settles it," said Mrs. Brown. "Now you must be thirsty after your journey. Mr. Brown can get you some tea while I go and meet our daughter Judy." "But Mary," said Mr. Brown, "we don't even know its name." Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. "I know," she said. "We'll call him Paddington, after the station." Paddington, 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 Paddington. The bear tested the name several times to make sure. Yes, it sounds very important." Mr. Brown tried it out next. "Follow me, Paddington," he said. "I'll take you to the snack bar." Mr. Brown was as good as his word. Paddington had never seen so many snacks on one tray, and he didn't know which to try first. He was so hungry and thirsty, he climbed up on the table to get a better look. Mr. Brown turned away, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry!" cried Mrs. Brown when she arrived with Judy. "What are you doing to that poor bear?" Paddington jumped up to raise his hat, and in his haste he trod on a strawberry tart, skidded on the cream, and fell over backwards into his cup of tea. "I think we'd better go before anything else happens," said Mr. Brown. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home and you can meet Mrs. Bird and my brother Jonathan." Mr. Brown led the way to a waiting taxi. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens, please," he said. The driver stared at Paddington. "Bears is extra," he growled. "Sticky bears is twice as much. And make sure none of it comes off on my interior. It was clean when I set out this morning." The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and there were cars and big red buses everywhere. Paddington waved to some people waiting at a bus stop, and several of them waved back. It was all very friendly. Paddington tapped the taxi driver on his shoulder. "It isn't a bit like Darky's Peru," he announced. The man jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice. "Cream," he said bitterly. "Cream and jam all over me coat." He slid the little window behind him shut. "Oh dear, Henry," murmured Mrs. Brown. "I wonder if we're doing the right thing." Fortunately, before anyone had time to answer, they arrived at Windsor Gardens, and Judy helped Paddington onto the pavement. "Now, you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," she said. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce at times, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll really like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to wobble. "I'm sure I shall if you say so," he replied. "The thing is, will she like me?" "Goodness gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "What have you got there?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear called Paddington, and he's coming to stay with us." "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird, as Paddington raised his hat. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "I'm afraid I stepped on a jam tart by mistake," said Paddington. "Yes, I can see that," said Mrs. Bird. "You'd better have a bath before you're very much older. Judy can turn it on for you. I dare say you'll be wanting some marmalade too." "I think she likes you," whispered Judy. Paddington had never been in a bathroom before, and while the water was running, he made himself at home. First of all, he tried writing his new name in the steam on the mirror. Then he used Mr. Brown's shaving foam to draw a map of Peru on the floor. It wasn't until a drip landed on his head that he remembered what he was supposed to be doing. He soon discovered that getting into a bath is one thing, but it's quite another matter getting out again, especially when it's full of soapy water. Paddington tried calling out, "Help!" At first in a quiet voice so as not to disturb anyone, then very loudly, "Help! Help! Help!" When that didn't work, he began bailing the water out with his hat. But the hat had holes in it, several holes, and his map of Peru soon turned into a sea of foam. Suddenly, Jonathan and Judy burst into the bathroom and lifted a dripping Paddington onto the floor. "Thank goodness you're all right," cried Judy. "We heard you calling out." "Fancy making such a mess," said Jonathan admiringly. "You should have pulled the plug out." "Oh," said Paddington, "I never thought of that." When Paddington came downstairs, he looked so clean, no one could possibly be cross with him. His fur was all soft and silky, his nose gleamed, and his paws had lost all traces of the jam and cream. The Browns made room for him in a small armchair, and Mrs. Bird brought him a pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast and marmalade. "Now," said Mrs. Brown, "you must tell us all about yourself. I'm sure you must have had lots of adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of a bear." He settled back in the armchair. "I was brought up by my Aunt Lucy in darkest Peru," he began, "but she had to go into a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully, and a hush fell over the room as everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown tried coughing. Then he reached across and poked Paddington. "Well, I never," Mr. Brown said. "I do believe he's fast asleep." "After all that's happened to him," said Mrs. Brown, "is it any wonder?" We can see Paddington, after his adventures from Peru to Paddington Station, he's ready for a rest. Boys and girls, the next thing that you're going to do today is you're going to complete a story map, remembering all the things that you remember from our Paddington story. Okay, so first of all, we are at Paddington Station because Mr. and Mrs. Brown, I've drawn Mr. and Mrs. Brown here, are going to pick up their daughter, Judy, when, out of the corner of their eye, they spot a little bear and his suitcase. As they get a bit closer to him, they realise that he's got a luggage tag on. So I've drawn the little luggage tag on Paddington, and the luggage tag says, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." So what I might just do here is just draw a nice big luggage tag. "Please look after this bear." And that's going with Paddington. Okay, and then they ask him a little bit about himself, don't they? But they're not sure whether or not to take him home or not. So they ask him, they say, have you got any plans? Would you like to come home with us? So they have a little conversation with him, they have a chat, and they decide that they're going to take him home. Then after that, they say, "Oh, well, we need to go," and we say, "We must be quite hungry." So Mrs. Brown goes to find Judy. But before that, they need to think of a name for him. So the next big thing that happens is they named him Paddington because of the place where they found him, at the train station. So they named him Paddington after the train station. So just drawn a little train, because that's why they called him Paddington, because they found him at Paddington train station. After that, Mr. Brown takes Paddington for some snacks at the snack bar. So I'm going to draw Mr. Brown. Here's Mr. Brown. And Paddington go and sit at a table and draw the table. They have some cakes. Put some cakes on the table. And Paddington sat here. I'm going to put his hat on him, his duffel coat, and his lovely wellies. And they have some tea and cakes at the snack bar. So this is the snack bar at the train station. Paddington has a little accident and he's skidded on the strawberry tarts and into his cup of tea. So I'm going to draw a little cup of tea here, because Paddington accidentally falls into it. I'm going to draw him with a bit of a worried face because he's just slipped into it. So there's the cup of tea. I'm just drawing an arrow to show that Paddington slips into it. And that is just as Judy, the little girl, and Mum come back to see them. So Judy and Mum come back, and that's just happened. Then they decide to get in a taxi to go home to meet Mrs. Bird and Jonathan. So I'm going to draw a big taxi here, big car, special car that takes people around in London. There's the taxi. So they grumble. The taxi driver grumbles a little bit. He says, "Sticky bears, I don't want sticky bears in my interior sticking to my seats." But eventually they all get back into the car and zoom along to Windsor Gardens. In the taxi, Paddington causes a little bit of a problem because he gets cream all over the taxi driver. And at this point, Mrs. Brown's wondering, have we done the right thing? So Mrs. Brown's face at this moment in time might be a bit worried. You might like to draw Mrs. Brown looking a little bit worried. And then they arrived at Windsor Gardens. So I'm going to draw the house at Windsor Gardens where the Brown family live. Here's this lovely house, and the taxi takes them all the way to Windsor Gardens. And when they get there, Judy says, "You're going to meet Mrs. Bird." Mrs. Bird is ready when they get there, and Mrs. Bird is an old lady who helps look after the house. And there she is, and she asks a few questions about Paddington. But she likes him because he has good manners, because he takes his hat off to say hello. She says, "I think you should go and get in the bath, Paddington, and get yourself nice and washed, because you've got all those cakes all over you from when you slipped earlier." So Paddington goes upstairs and has an amazing time and takes himself into the bathtub. I'm just drawing a bathtub. You might want to draw some lovely bubbly baths. And Paddington's head and his hat poking out, because he's such a smiley, happy bear. Goes and has a great time in the bath. He does draw a map of Peru. Now I want to draw a little map on the floor. And he tries to write his name in the mirror. But he gets his bath full of super soapy water. He does make a little bit of a mess though. And when Judy and Jonathan come in, they're like, "Oh, what's a mess, Paddington?" But it's okay. They help him out, take him out, dry him off, and take him downstairs to go and speak to the family. The family make him a pot of tea and some toast and marmalade, and he sits in a lovely armchair, really cosy armchair, to start to tell them all about his journey to London from deepest, darkest Peru. But he closes his eyes. I'm going to draw him now as he's fallen asleep, because he's had quite a long journey. At the end of the story, he just falls asleep in the armchair. So here is my story picture map. I'd love you to have a go at doing your own story map all about our story of Paddington Bear.